The only way to revitalize investment in Alberta is for Alberta to leave Canada, shortest free trade agreement ever in the history of the world. There will be zero tariffs on the Alberta side of the border on all goods and services, and zero tariffs on the U.S. side of the border on all Alberta goods and services.
Push for Alberta to join U.S. is a new peril. That's right.
The only way to revitalize investment in Alberta is for Alberta to leave Canada. Imagine it, the shortest free trade agreement ever in the history of the world. It would be a deal with zero tariffs on the Alberta side for all goods and services, and zero tariffs on the United States side for all goods and services coming out of Alberta.
Oh, I love how The Guardian reports reviving long-standing anxieties about foreign involvement in domestic unity debates. To go to a foreign country and to ask for assistance in breaking up Canada, there's an old-fashioned word for that, British Columbia's Premier David Eby told reporters, and that word is treason.
That is as simple and direct as a trade agreement could possibly get. This is what proponents are suggesting when they talk about Alberta considering independence. The idea of Alberta joining the U.S., which has been floated quietly by some leaders and influencers, is now being taken seriously by many.
The secret meetings by unelected Albertans with U.S. officials have been branded treasonous by some. So understand that Quebec going into France and meeting with foreign leaders over there was not treasonous, but the minute that Albertans start talking with Donald Trump, that's what's treasonous.
And it's causing real anxiety in Ottawa. So why is this conversation even happening? Why are people in Western Canada starting to talk seriously about breaking away from Confederation? My dear viewers, the reason is straightforward. When a government ignores a particular region for decades, providing little support and consistently disregarding the interests of that region, it is not surprising that the people there start feeling frustrated and overlooked. Restlessness is a natural reaction.
Ottawa wants to add $10 a barrel to the cost of oil in Alberta, so no one will want to invest in Alberta. Listen to this.
Everybody refers to it as the pipe dream MOU, not the pipeline MOU. I mean, it's, so $50 billion carbon sucking machine. We're going to add $10 a barrel to the cost of production of oil in Alberta.
British Columbia is very different. People there are looking at their provincial balance sheets, their economies, and the obstacles they face, and they are starting to question who exactly is this system benefiting. This is not idle speculation. There have been secret meetings between some unelected Albertans and U.S. officials. Some critics have called these meetings treasonous, but that claim raises an important question.
Maybe if we're really, really good little boys and girls, they'll let us have a pipeline. They will let us have a pipeline in 2040. Quite frankly, if it was fully implemented, I think would be worse for Alberta than the National Energy Program, in terms of killing investment in the...
Let's begin with Alberta, because everything starts here. Alberta has a long history of leaning conservative politically. For more than 90 years, the province has been guided largely by conservative governments. This is not a matter of opinion. It is historical political fact. Over the same time, Ottawa has frequently shifted in the opposite direction.
Oh, and here's the irony of all of this. Ottawa depends upon Western resource revenue to fund its national programs. Equalization payments, federal services, national transfers, all of that relies upon economic productivity from somewhere.
And then suddenly tell them that their values and priorities no longer matter. That approach simply does not work. Alberta wants to be open for business. They want American banks and financial institutions to invest freely in the province, without Ottawa adding layers of regulations that restrict the oil industry. They want the federal government to stop blocking pipelines and other resource projects.
Range anywhere from high 20s to near 40%.
Canada is broken, folks. A separatist push for referendum on independence from Canada, meetings with foreign officials perceived to be sympathetic to their cause, accusations of treason.
That is not a fringe group of people sitting in a basement. That represents a significant portion of the population. More than half of Albertans believe that separation is at least a real possibility. That indicates that the conversation has moved far beyond protest signs and social media commentary. This is a serious and growing political sentiment. Canada, in the eyes of these voters, is broken.
David Eby might want to understand where his people are at because the rise for independence is growing within British Columbia as well. But wait till you see some of these videos, folks.
Is one example. It asserts provincial control over natural resources, and it is not just symbolic language. It represents real constitutional positioning. When a province begins drafting laws to reinforce its own autonomy, it signals that the province is preparing for future challenges. Ottawa might dismiss these efforts as noise, but for Saskatchewan, it is a matter of self-defense. So when the federal government labels it as noise and the province frames it as self-defense,
it's good for America as well. If Canada would just get on board, it could be good for Canada, but they don't because they're commies, and commies are going to commie. Okay, they're one world communists.
Between 2007 and 2022, Alberta contributed more than $200 billion net to federal finances. That is a massive contribution compared to other provinces. British Columbia and Ontario also contribute significantly, but Alberta's contribution towers above most others. In contrast, provinces like Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick are net recipients, relying on federal funding to balance their budgets.
Google countries in the world where citizens don't pay income tax, and you will see the list. And soon, Alberta will be on it because we have more wealth in the ground that we can produce and export and sell.
What exactly are they paying for? The same question applies to Saskatchewan. If they produce potash and uranium that supply global markets but face bureaucratic hurdles, what are the benefits of being tied to Ottawa? The federal government talks about unity, but Western Canadians see imbalance. They feel that the system is working against them, not for them. British Columbia is another important piece of this puzzle. BC controls the Pacific Gateway through Vancouver.
Here's where people are really beginning to realize that this is important and could happen, because Jeff Raff posted this. He said, to all unionized workers in Alberta, take out your last pay stub, take a red pen, circle the federal income tax deducted number on your pay stub. Day one after Alberta independence, we can afford to eliminate.
When BC challenges Ottawa over environmental rules or project timelines, it is not a provincial tantrum. It is a trade superpower asserting its control. British Columbia's Premier, David Eby, understands the growing independence movement in the province. The desire for autonomy is growing alongside the economic reality that BC holds significant influence over trade and logistics. This is where the United States enters the conversation.
You go to work and you've worked your butt off in whatever it is you do, and you get your pay stub or your paycheck, rather than seeing a smaller portion of it coming to you and the rest going off to Ottawa, you keep all of the fruits of your hard labor.
These provinces are economically intertwined with the United States in ways that eastern provinces may not fully realize. When western provinces consider engaging with the U.S., it is not necessarily about disloyalty, it is about economic reality. The economic gravity pulls them toward the nearest, largest market,
and more resource activity that we can engage in than many of these other countries that are on the list. And we have a smaller population, in ratio to ensure that initially we'll have lower taxes and we...
Energy policy is another major source of tension. Take Bill C-69, which changed the federal review process for many resource projects. While supporters called it environmental oversight, critics view it as a veto tool. Alberta sees project delays measured in years, costing billions of dollars in lost investments. Investors do not like uncertainty. Capital moves to jurisdictions that are more predictable and business-friendly.
And you will see the list. And soon, Alberta will be on it because we have more wealth in the ground that we can produce and export and sell, and more resource activity that we can engage in than many of these other countries that are on the list. And we have a smaller population.
Comparing Alberta with places like Texas or North Dakota, this is not speculation, it is basic economics. While Ottawa hosts climate summits, investors hold exit meetings, quietly shifting capital to regions that provide better stability and returns. If implemented fully, policies like Bill C-69 could potentially do more damage to Alberta's investment climate than even the National Energy Program of the past. Ironically, Ottawa relies heavily on Western resource revenue to fund national programs. Federal services, equalization payments, and national transfers all depend on the economic productivity of provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. Alberta's GDP per capita consistently ranks among the highest in Canada. Saskatchewan contributes far more than its population would suggest. And BC drives Pacific trade. If any of these economic engines slows down, federal revenue will be affected immediately. This raises uncomfortable questions for Ottawa and the country as a whole. What would happen to Canada's economy, or even the Canadian dollar, if Western production declined or political tensions escalated? Commodity currencies like the Canadian dollar move in line with energy prices, and investors monitor political stability closely. If Western Canada becomes unstable, capital markets will react accordingly, regardless of what Ottawa claims. The path toward a referendum for independence is also clear. The 1998 Supreme Court reference regarding Quebec's secession established that if a province holds a clear referendum with a clear question, there is a constitutional obligation for the federal government to negotiate. That legal pathway exists, and while it was designed with Quebec in mind, the reasoning applies to any province because the ruling does not restrict its application to Quebec alone. Alberta's leaders are studying this ruling line by line, preparing carefully and ensuring they understand the constitutional framework. This is not about grandstanding or playing political games. It is about knowing the rules of the system. Ottawa can choose to ignore this reality, dismiss the concerns as dramatic, or accuse Western leaders of exaggerating the situation. But the legal and economic facts are clear, and they cannot be wished away. So, as Alberta continues to explore its options, as Saskatchewan quietly asserts autonomy, and as British Columbia flexes its economic muscle, the federal government faces a new challenge. They must reckon with decades of political neglect, a system that appears imbalanced to the West, and growing interest in sovereignty and independence. This is not just about politics or ideology, it is about real economic forces, historical grievances, and the desire for a fair and predictable system. For investors, policymakers, and citizens alike, these developments cannot be ignored. The conversation about Alberta leaving Canada is no longer hypothetical. It is grounded in economics, law, and the lived reality of Western Canadians who feel overlooked, frustrated, and ready for change. The only way to revitalize investment in Alberta is for Alberta to leave Canada. They can frame frustration as extremism, but that's not going to fix or change the underlying tensions, folks. You see, Alberta voters are looking at a variety of issues, things that affect their daily lives, their jobs, and the future of their province. They look at federal regulations that slow down projects, fiscal transfers that often feel unfair, pipelines and infrastructure projects that are stalled for years, and cultural differences between the West and Ottawa. And they are starting to say, we need some leverage, we need some way to protect our interests. Meanwhile, Saskatchewan is quietly observing economic damage caused by federal decisions and is building legal tools to protect themselves. British Columbia is watching trade disputes and using their port power to flex influence. And it's important to note something else. When you search for countries where citizens don't pay income tax, you will see a small, exclusive list. And soon, Alberta will likely be on that list because they have enormous natural wealth beneath their ground: oil, gas, minerals. And they can produce, export, and sell these resources at large scale. That wealth could allow them to significantly reduce taxes, initially lowering them and potentially moving toward a zero-tax model for citizens. So here's another real question for you. If the Western provinces decide they want more autonomy, or perhaps even a completely different arrangement altogether, what exactly is Ottawa's response going to be? More regulation, more speeches about national unity, more glossy press releases and polling numbers? Because here's the thing, folks. If Alberta moves toward independence or a stronger autonomy position, Saskatchewan is very likely to go along with them. And if Saskatchewan follows, then Manitoba is suddenly in a difficult position geographically. Manitoba is stuck in the middle, literally connecting the east to the west, and if Alberta and Saskatchewan tilt toward independence, Manitoba will have to make a very tough decision about whether to stay fully aligned with Ottawa or coordinate more with its western neighbors. On top of all of that, if British Columbia decides to tilt even slightly toward greater provincial control, the Pacific Gateway, which handles nearly 40% of Canada's trade with Asia, could shift the balance entirely. That is why many analysts say Alberta is the hinge in this situation. If Alberta stays firmly within the Federation but negotiates renewed terms that respect its priorities, then the system could stabilize. But if Alberta pushes hard toward sovereignty, that ripple effect will spread very quickly across the prairies and beyond. Every province is economically linked to Alberta in some way, whether through trade, resource flows, or fiscal transfers. That is a structural reality. Alberta has more resources beneath the ground than many of the other countries on that no-tax list, and with a smaller population, the province could implement lower taxes immediately and eventually move toward eliminating provincial income tax. So let's go back to Saskatchewan for a moment. Saskatchewan is a province that doesn't make headlines as loudly as Alberta does. They don't shout or wave protest signs. But here's the thing. They are extremely methodical. While everyone is arguing about Alberta, Saskatchewan quietly prepares, building the legal infrastructure they will need if the West begins asserting more autonomy. The Saskatchewan First Act, which I mentioned earlier, is a law that reinforces provincial authority over critical areas like natural resources and taxation. This is not symbolic theater or political posturing. This is serious constitutional positioning. When a province starts codifying its jurisdiction in writing, it is not improvising. It is preparing for leverage and strategic influence in the event of federal pushback. People are beginning to realize just how serious this is, and that it could actually happen. One example that illustrates this came from Jeff Raff, who posted a suggestion to unionized workers in Alberta. Take your last pay stub, grab a red pen, and circle the federal income tax deduction. On day 1, if Alberta becomes independent, that federal income tax can be eliminated locally, allowing workers to keep more of what they earn. Saskatchewan is also documenting billions in economic losses tied to federal decisions. Whether or not you agree with their exact numbers, the point is that they are quantifying their grievances. They are taking abstract frustration and turning it into measurable strategic information. When government frustration is converted into spreadsheets, calculations, and legal documentation, it becomes far more than just an emotional reaction. It becomes a structured plan. Ottawa can try to dismiss the rhetoric, but it is much harder to ignore documented economic claims that are directly tied to policy outcomes. And look at the scale of Saskatchewan's economic integration. They are the world's largest producer of potash and a major supplier of uranium. Their agricultural output is massive, and a significant portion of it goes directly into U.S. markets or global markets that rely on American logistics. Saskatchewan's economy is deeply integrated into continental supply chains. It is not isolated, it is plugged directly into the economic systems of the continent. So the question becomes very simple. If Alberta moves toward greater autonomy, is Saskatchewan going to sit quietly, or will it activate the legal and constitutional tools it has already prepared for this exact scenario? The infrastructure is ready. Referendum triggers are in place. Sovereignty language exists in law. Resource jurisdiction arguments are documented. This is not accidental. This is careful planning. Think about it like this. You go to work, you earn your paycheck, and instead of seeing a large portion of it leave Ottawa in the form of federal income taxes, you get to keep the fruits of your labor. That is a very powerful motivator. People understand that principle intuitively, and it adds momentum to the independence conversation in Alberta. Now, just to be clear, if you hear some buzzing in the background, that is just renovation work happening in my house, not federal agents finding me. So let's keep going. We should also discuss British Columbia again because BC is a critical factor in this debate. BC changes everything in this equation. It is not just another province. BC controls the ports, it controls Pacific trade access, and nearly 40% of Canada's trade with Asia flows through BC infrastructure. That gives BC enormous leverage on a national level. If BC leans even slightly toward more provincial control, Ottawa will feel the impact immediately. The potential influence of BC cannot be overstated in this context. Shifting to Manitoba, we see another layer of complexity. Manitoba rarely makes dramatic headlines, but geography gives it a lot of inherent power. It sits directly between Ontario and the Prairie provinces, physically connecting east to west. On top of that, Manitoba exports hydroelectric power to the United States and ships agricultural products south. Its manufacturing base is deeply integrated with American supply chains. While Manitoba may not be shouting about independence, it cannot ignore economic gravity. If Alberta and Saskatchewan escalate constitutional tensions, Manitoba will face a critical choice: remain aligned with Ottawa or coordinate more closely with the western provinces. Geography will force this decision. You cannot pretend the middle of the map does not matter when major transport corridors and energy grids run directly through it. Do you understand the implications here? How many people would like to see federal income tax eliminated and keep the full benefit of their labor? This is not a minor issue. It is a real driver of political and economic momentum in Alberta and beyond. Quebec also plays an important role in the dynamics of sovereignty. Quebec has the most experience with independence politics, having nearly left in 1995. The Supreme Court reference exists specifically because of Quebec's history with secession. Western provinces study Quebec's playbook very closely. They understand how to use leverage within a federation to protect provincial interests. Quebec's knowledge of constitutional negotiation did not disappear over the last 30 years. Polling there shows support for independence hovering in the 40s at times. This means Ottawa is managing not one but two potential constitutional stress points. If the West destabilizes the conversation and Quebec continues to maintain pressure from the other side, Ottawa is left in a very weak negotiating position. Again, this is not speculation. This is basic federal math and political reality. Now let's add another geopolitical layer, the Yukon. The Yukon rarely enters political debate, but it should, because the territory contains rare earth minerals that modern technology depends upon. These minerals are critical for electronics, renewable energy systems, and defense technology. As global competition for resources increases, control of mineral-rich territories like the Yukon becomes strategically important. Alberta, with its enormous natural wealth, will also increasingly be part of this equation. Western provinces have more resources in the ground than many of the countries that are already low-tax or no-tax jurisdictions. With a smaller population, they could implement lower taxes quickly and sustainably. If tensions escalate and the Yukon begins aligning policy-wise with Western provinces, or even southward toward continental cooperation, Ottawa's Arctic leverage shifts dramatically. Arctic sovereignty is not symbolic. It is tied to trade routes, defense, and mineral access. Any political shift in the Yukon has immediate international implications. This moves the conversation from domestic politics into the realm of geopolitics. Economic integration between Western Canada and the United States is already very deep. Energy flows south. Agricultural products flow south. Manufacturing is integrated with American supply chains, and hydroelectric power is exported. Trade corridors are continental. Political separation is not even necessary for economic integration to intensify. The Western provinces are already closely tied economically to the U.S., which is why their discussions about autonomy are so significant. So, what happens if Ottawa continues to dismiss Western frustration as noise? What happens if federal regulation continues to tighten while the Western resource provinces argue for more freedom and expanded economic control? Markets will respond long before politicians do. Investors look at jurisdictional stability. Capital moves where it is predictable. If Western Canada signals constitutional uncertainty and Ottawa signals inflexibility, investors will wait and then move money elsewhere. If that happens, federal programs reliant on Western productivity will feel the consequences immediately. Ottawa will struggle to manage the economic fallout. In short, Western provinces have strategic leverage. Alberta is the hinge, Saskatchewan is quietly building the legal framework, BC has trade influence, Manitoba sits in the middle and controls key corridors, Yukon holds rare resources, and Quebec continues to pressure from the east. All of these factors create a situation where ignoring the underlying issues is no longer an option. Momentum toward greater autonomy or independence is real and growing, and it is rooted in economics, law, geography, and history. Federal inaction or dismissive rhetoric will only accelerate the conversation and influence decisions about capital, policy, and constitutional negotiations. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for hanging out, everybody. Make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, make sure to share this with your friends as we continue to cover this very interesting, very critical time in our history. We always appreciate your support. Thanks for hanging out. See you in the next one.